There are stories that whisper, others that roar. But some arrive in silence, cloaked in snow, carried by two pit bulls with eyes full of things no one should ever see. Welcome to Vale Marks, where we bring you stories that don't just entertain, but linger. This video holds a powerful message about loss, healing, and the extraordinary bond between humans and animals. If you're someone who believes in second chances, in the quiet heroes who wait in the cold, please stay until the end. This isn't just a story. It's a truth, a tribute, a lesson, and maybe, just maybe, a beginning. The wind had its own language up in the Bitterroot Mountains, low, lonesome, and constant. It pressed through the trees like a memory that refused to leave, whispering through the needles of the pines, curling beneath the eaves of the old wooden cabin like a ghost looking for a name. Wyatt McCall hadn't spoken to another human being in 87 days. Not that he was counting. He didn't have a calendar on the wall or a phone in his pocket. He didn't keep track of the mail, didn't check the radio, and hadn't driven into town since before the last frost. Winter had come early that year, and with it, the kind of stillness that suited him just fine. At 58, Wyatt had the posture of a man who had once stood tall but didn't bother much with that anymore. His hair had gone white along the edges, not evenly but in jagged patches, like the snow collecting outside his window. His hands were scarred and calloused, firefighter hands, K9 handler hands, and his shoulders carried the kind of quiet that people used to mistake for strength. These days, it was just weight. The cabin wasn't much. He'd built it himself years ago when he still believed in having a future. One room, a stone hearth, a cot in the corner, a few shelves lined with old paperbacks and tarnished tools. There were no pictures on the walls, not anymore. He had taken them down after the fire. That fire. People had called it a freak accident, a sudden wind shift, a mist flare, a cabin that went up in flames too fast for anyone to react. But Wyatt knew exactly how long 36 seconds could last when you were trapped behind a wall of heat and smoke, screaming your family's names. His wife, Charlotte, had been making dinner. Their son, Jack, 6 years old, had been coloring by the window, and Wyatt had been too far away, out on a rescue call, trying to save someone else. That irony tasted like ash every time he thought about it. He'd tried to go back afterward, tried to put on the uniform, tried to train the rookies, tried to hold the leash of a new dog, but nothing felt right. The world had gone gray around the edges, and even the dogs, creatures who used to read his heartbeat like scripture, had begun to avoid his shadow. There had been one who stayed, though. Ranger, a broad-shouldered pit bull with a white blaze on his chest and eyes too smart for his own good. Ranger had been more than a partner. He was the last living thing that had known Charlotte's laugh and Jack's bedtime songs. Wyatt had thought, foolishly, that maybe he could hold on to something that mattered. But pit bulls age faster than grief. Ranger passed away 2 winters ago. Old age, slow and gentle. Wyatt buried him beneath the tallest pine behind the cabin, the only place that still felt sacred. He marked the grave with an old fire helmet and didn't say a word. After that, the silence became permanent. He didn't watch TV, didn't answer mail, didn't talk to the hikers who occasionally passed by. The only visitors he tolerated were the deer who wandered too close and the fox that left paw prints on his porch some mornings. He didn't miss people. He didn't trust people. He chopped his own firewood, hunted small game, fixed what broke with tools older than most of the kids now applying to Fire Academy. He lived off the grid, off the map, and as far off the emotional spectrum as a man could manage without becoming stone. Some people called it retreat. Others would have called it grief. Wyatt called it peace. But even peace has an edge to it, a hollowness that creeps in when the fire dies low and the wind grows sharp. At night, when the sky cracked open with stars so cold they looked like wounds, Wyatt would sit by the hearth, a cup of black coffee cooling in his hands, and let the silence say everything he didn't. He told himself he was done. Done with service, done with rescue, done with the unpredictable tangle of caring about anything that could be lost. He believed that, right up until the night the scratching started at the door. A sound too faint to be trusted. A whimper too soft to be ignored. He thought it was the wind at first, but the wind didn't cry. And Wyatt McCall, man of stone, of scars, of winters survived, stood up slowly, every muscle aching with years he'd tried to bury, and walked toward the sound that would change everything. He didn't know then what waited on the other side, but the mountains did, and so did the wind. Because sometimes the ones who've buried their hearts the deepest are the first to feel when something lost is trying to be found. The storm came in hard that night, faster than the forecast had warned. By dusk, the trees had disappeared into a wall of white. By midnight, even the outline of Wyatt's woodpile was lost in the swirling veil outside his cabin. The wind shrieked like something ancient and grieving, and the snow didn't fall so much as it attacked. Sideways, relentless, bone deep. Wyatt had banked the fire early, knowing the storm would test the cabin's insulation. He had no plans to sleep. Nights like this weren't meant for sleeping. They were meant for remembering. He sat in his worn armchair, coffee gone cold on the table beside him, listening to the timbers creak under the weight of the wind. The storm had a way of finding the cracks, even in the best-built walls. It sounded like whispers some nights. Other nights, it sounded like his son calling out from the other side of memory. That was when he heard it. Faint, barely there. A soft, rhythmic scratching, like claws on wood. Wyatt's first instinct was to ignore it. The wind could mimic anything. But then came the whimper, thin, desperate, alive. He stood slowly, joints protesting, and reached for the flashlight by the door. He hadn't opened that door for anyone in months, but something pulled at him, as if the wind itself had curled its icy fingers around his spine. He unlatched the deadbolt and pushed the door open into the howl. The cold hit him like a slap. Visibility was nearly zero, just a swirling chaos of snowflakes and shadow. But the beam of his flashlight cut through the blur, and there, on the porch, huddled against the log siding, were two shapes. Dogs. One was larger, curled protectively around the smaller. The bigger one lifted his head slowly, eyes locking on Wyatt's like fire through smoke. He didn't growl, didn't flinch, just watched. The other, barely more than a pup, lay curled into a trembling ball beneath the curve of the first, her body so still, Wyatt thought she might already be gone. He stepped forward instinctively, dropping to one knee. The big one didn't move, but his eyes followed every gesture. Wyatt recognized the look, not fear, not aggression, calculated survival. This dog had seen things, suffered, endured, and he had chosen to place himself between the cold and the creature under his care. Wyatt reached out slowly, fingers trembling more from something deeper than cold. He touched the larger dog first, running a gloved hand gently along a flank that was too thin, fur matted with ice. The dog didn't recoil, didn't lean in either, just accepted the contact like a necessary compromise. Then Wyatt touched the smaller one. She whimpered, just once, but didn't resist. When he lifted her, her body was limp, light as a breath. He tucked her inside his coat, cradling her against his chest, then nodded to the bigger dog. "Come on," he muttered, not sure why he said it out loud. The dog hesitated for only a second before stepping forward. Inside the cabin, warmth returned like a question, unsure of its place. Wyatt laid the pup on an old flannel blanket near the fire, stripped off his coat, and wrapped her in it. The bigger dog stood near the doorway, shaking snow from his back, then padded cautiously toward the hearth, watching every move. Wyatt didn't own dog food anymore. He hadn't needed it in years. But he had broth. He poured some into a chipped bowl, tore up a slice of bread, and let it soak before offering it. The bigger dog sniffed once, then began to eat slowly, deliberately. The pup made no move. Wyatt turned her gently. Her ribs were sharp against his hands, her paws cracked from cold. Then his eyes fell on her chest. A mark, faint but unmistakable. A flame-shaped birthmark just above her heart, tapered like a teardrop tipped in fire. He stared at it, frozen. It was identical to the tattoo his son had drawn in Sharpie on Wyatt's forearm one summer years ago. Just a silly doodle at the time. Jack had called it fire love, said it meant the people you loved could never burn out. Not even after they were gone. Wyatt hadn't thought about that in years. He looked at the pup again, then at the larger dog who had settled himself beside her, eyes still watching, still waiting. "You protecting her?" Wyatt asked softly. The dog didn't answer, of course, but something in his stillness did. Something in the quiet way he placed one paw across the blanket, resting it lightly over the pup's side like a shield. Wyatt sat down slowly, cross-legged on the wooden floor, not caring about the cold seeping through his jeans. The fire cast flickering shadows across the cabin, painting the walls with movement that felt alive for the first time in forever. He looked at the pup, then at the larger dog. "I can't promise I know what I'm doing," he whispered. The bigger dog blinked, slow and steady. "And I can't promise I'll be enough." Still nothing. Just breathing. Just presence. Wyatt sighed, rubbing his hands together before laying one gently on the pup's back. Her breathing was faint, but regular. She shifted slightly, tucking her face deeper into the flannel, and for the first time since he found her, her body began to relax. Something cracked inside Wyatt then, a soundless thing, a pressure that had lived under his ribs for years without language. He looked back to the big dog. "You got a name?" Silence. "Well," Wyatt murmured, "how about Ash?" The dog didn't react, but he didn't turn away either. He looked down at the pup again. "Mira," he said softly. You look like a Mira." Outside, the wind howled again, but inside, something had shifted. The cold hadn't won, not tonight. And for the first time in years, Wyatt McCall didn't feel entirely alone. 2 dogs, 2 souls, no names, no history, but maybe, just maybe, a future. Together. The morning after the storm, the snow lay heavy and blue across the mountain ridge. The light had changed, brighter, clearer, but the cold remained, stubborn and sharp. Wyatt loaded the 2 pit bulls into his truck with hands that moved more carefully than usual. The larger one, Ash, climbed in without resistance, settling into the passenger seat like he'd been there before. Mira had to be carried. She didn't flinch. She didn't look. She simply existed in Wyatt's arms, weightless and silent. The drive down the mountain took twice as long as usual. The roads were slick and uneven, tire tracks vanishing beneath fresh drifts. Wyatt didn't mind the slowness. Part of him wished the drive would last forever, so he didn't have to explain what he didn't understand. He hadn't planned on taking them to a vet. But when Mira had refused to eat and her eyes didn't track light, Wyatt realized this was beyond his experience. And there was only one person in this part of Montana he trusted with something broken. April Reeves. She was already waiting by the front door of her clinic when he pulled up, as if she'd known he was coming. The building had once been a ranger station. Now, it was a sanctuary for the forgotten and the fearful. It smelled of antiseptic, cedar wood, and something gentler, like chamomile and dried lavender. April was in her late 40s, tall and lean, with weathered skin and steel-gray hair pulled into a loose braid. Her eyes, sharp behind her glasses, softened when she saw the bundle Wyatt carried. "No appointment?" she said lightly. "I figured the storm was enough of one," he answered. April motioned toward the exam room. "Bring them in. Let's see what we're working with." Inside, she set up quietly, snapping on gloves and laying out clean towels. She didn't ask questions, not right away. That was her way. April had spent years in combat zones, working with dogs that had seen more than some soldiers. She knew better than to speak too soon. Wyatt placed Mira on the table, her tiny frame wrapped in a blanket, and Ash sat on the floor beside it, unmoving but alert. April's hands were firm but kind. She examined Mira first, gently parting fur, checking eyes, gums, paws. She clicked her tongue softly. Too light, dehydrated, malnourished, probably been like this for a while. She pressed a stethoscope to Mira's chest, frowning slightly. Heart rate's fast, not sick. More like she's running from something that hasn't stopped chasing her. Wyatt said nothing, just watched. Then April checked her ears and ran a scanner across her shoulder. No chip, she muttered. Wait. Hold on. She adjusted the scanner and passed it over again. Still nothing. She leaned in, pressing a thumb just below Mira's left ear, her brow furrowed. There's scar tissue here, she said quietly. Tiny but consistent. She turned to Wyatt. Someone cut the microchip out. Wyatt blinked. Why would anyone? Because they didn't want her traced, April replied, her voice hardening. This wasn't a rescue gone wrong, this was deliberate. She moved on to Ash, checking his vitals, his teeth. When she looked inside his mouth, she froze. Look at this, she said. Wyatt stepped closer. The molars were worn down, unnaturally flat, ground down in ways no chewing bone could explain. Stress grinding, April said, usually from trying to bite through steel or chain. And look here. She lifted one of Ash's paws, pressing gently against the pads. Scarred, burned, maybe, definitely exposed to hard surfaces, probably concrete. Wyatt exhaled slowly. These dogs, they've been in cages. April nodded. For a long time. She turned her attention back to Mira, who had curled into herself despite the warmth of the room. April reached for a small tool, metal clicking against the tray. Mira jolted violently, her whole body convulsed like a spring released, her breath hitched, legs twitching. April paused. That's not just startle reflex, that's trauma. She turned off the overhead lamp. Mira relaxed slightly in the dim light. She's hyper-aware of shadows, April said, and male voices, and metal sounds. That's a pattern I've only seen in dogs trained under extreme pressure. Military black site, private security, worst-case scenarios. Wyatt swallowed hard. So they weren't abandoned. April looked at him. Number they were discarded. For a moment, the room was silent. Wyatt stared at Mira, at the way she trembled even in sleep. Her body curled tightly like she could make herself vanish. He'd seen this before. In people. In the mirror. What do you want to do? April asked gently. He didn't answer right away. His eyes flicked from Mira to Ash. Ash met his gaze evenly, his face unreadable. But something passed between them. Not recognition, something deeper, mutual comprehension. They can stay with me, Wyatt said. April didn't object. As she cleaned up, she glanced back once more at the table. They're not going to be easy, she warned. This isn't a one-week fix. Wyatt nodded. Neither am I. And as he carried Mira back to the truck, with Ash following close behind, the Montana wind picked up again. But this time it felt less like a scream, and more like a breath. The snow melted slowly that week, revealing patches of brown earth and bent pine needles crushed under winter's weight. Wyatt didn't notice the change. He barely noticed time at all now. His hours were marked by small rituals, warming broth, checking Mira's eyes for brightness, watching Ash prowl the edge of the cabin as if guarding against enemies only he could sense. But something deeper had started to shift. It wasn't just the dogs that had been left on his porch. It was what they brought with them, and the questions that refused to let go. Ash, for all his strength and calm, flinched at the sound of gunmetal sliding into a holster. Wyatt had tested it once, an old reflex, habit in his fingers, and the look Ash gave him wasn't one of fear. It was recognition, and Mira. She still slept curled in corners, her body folded in on itself like a note never meant to be opened. The birthmark on her chest, a tiny flame-shaped blur, haunted Wyatt more than he cared to admit. Sometimes he caught himself staring at it, remembering Jack's little hands as he scribbled on Wyatt's arm with permanent marker, declaring, "Now you're fireproof too, Daddy." He hadn't felt fireproof in years. One night, unable to sleep, Wyatt picked up the phone he hadn't used in a long time. It was tucked inside a box beneath old training manuals and a photo of Ranger he'd tried to forget. The screen lit up slowly. No updates, no notifications. Just one number still saved under "Don't dial unless it matters." Eddie Cross, former military intel. Half ghost, half truth, and all trouble when he wanted to be. They'd met years ago during a federal canine surveillance training. Wyatt remembered Eddie as the kind of man who wore quiet like armor and trusted dogs more than people, which made him the kind of person Wyatt could still talk to. The call connected on the second ring. "McCall," came Eddie's voice, low and tired. "Thought you were dead." "I was," Wyatt said. Silence, then a sigh. "What do you need?" Wyatt didn't explain everything. Just enough. The dogs, the scars, the chip removals, the reactions, the silence that wasn't silence, but something deeper. Conditioned restraint. Eddie didn't interrupt. He just listened. When Wyatt finished, Eddie said only, "Give me 2 days." It took 3. When Eddie called back, his voice was different, clipped, careful. "You were right to be suspicious," he said. "I dug into some old contractor databases, stuff most people don't even know existed. There's a name that keeps popping up." Wyatt waited. "ARC-K9, Eddie said. "Stands for Advanced Response Canine Unit 9. Off-the-books program started by a security contractor back in 2013. They used pit bulls and shepherds mostly. Trained for rapid deployment, solo operation conflict scenarios, urban containment, border skirmishes, riot suppression." Wyatt's stomach turned. "They weren't meant for public use," Eddie continued. "These dogs were tools, weapons with heartbeat triggers. They were trained to respond without a handler if necessary. Highly conditioned. No tolerance for unpredictability." He paused. "And the ones who couldn't meet that criteria, too gentle, too emotional, too aware, they didn't get rehomed." Wyatt closed his eyes. "What happened to them?" "They were erased," Eddie said simply. "Files deleted, tags destroyed. A few may have been relocated if someone inside the program had a conscience. But most? Never seen again." Wyatt glanced across the room. Ash was lying near the fire, chin on his paws, watching Mira. She slept beside an old quilt, not shaking tonight, just breathing, slow and even. "And you think," Wyatt began. "I don't think," Eddie replied. "I know. Based on the chip scars, tooth wear, response patterns, they fit the ARC mold, down to the birth date range. Someone got them out, McCall. Someone risked a hell of a lot to let those two go." Wyatt didn't speak for a long moment. Then, "Thank you." "I didn't do it for you," Eddie said. "I did it for them." The call ended. The silence in the cabin returned, but this time it didn't feel heavy. It felt loaded, like a fuse waiting for flame. Later that night, Wyatt sat at his kitchen table, pen in hand, an old leather-bound notebook open in front of him. He hadn't written anything down since the day of Jack's funeral. But now, the words poured out. He wrote their names at the top of the page. Not the names they were born with, because maybe they never had any, but the names they had now, the names he had given them. Ash, Mira. He wrote what he'd seen, what he knew, what April had guessed and Eddie had confirmed. He didn't write for the courts, or the press, or any agency looking to make things disappear. He wrote to remember, to bear witness, to give shape to the ghosts now curled beside his hearth. Ash doesn't bite, he wrote. He shields. Mira doesn't bark, he added. She survives. He paused, tapping the pen gently against the paper. Then he wrote the words he hadn't allowed himself to feel. They weren't born broken. They were broken by someone. And if someone broke them, then maybe someone else can help them heal. He didn't know what would come next. But for the first time in years, Wyatt McCall knew what mattered. Not justice, not revenge, but truth. And two dogs who deserved to be more than what someone else had trained them to be. The first sound was a whisper, not the kind made by wind or trees or the moan of settling snow. It was sharper, intentional, a boot brushing against frozen earth, too light to be casual, too cautious to be innocent. Wyatt had been asleep in the armchair, one hand still resting on the edge of Mira's blanket. The fire had burned down low, casting only a faint orange glow across the wooden floor. Ash, curled by the door, was already awake. His ears were up, his body rigid. Then came the growl, low, deep, not like anything Wyatt had ever heard from him, not protective, warning. Wyatt sat up slowly. His hand reached instinctively toward the locked case under the couch. It had been there for years, untouched, an echo of the man he used to be. He hesitated only for a second before dragging it out. Click. The combination tumbled into place with a sound that felt heavier than it should. Inside, a flare gun, a rusted sidearm, a flashlight, and a knife so sharp it could shave fear off bone. He hadn't needed any of it for a long time. But something was wrong tonight. Very wrong. He moved quietly to the window and killed the lantern. Outside, the snow reflected just enough light to silhouette the trees. That's when he saw them. 3 shapes, maybe 4, creeping along the edge of the clearing. No flashlights, no crunch of snow. They knew how to move. Not thieves, operators. Wyatt's heart didn't race. It hadn't done that in years. Instead, a deep, old stillness settled into him, the kind that had saved lives in burning buildings, the kind that knew when to breathe and when to hold breath completely. He knelt beside Ash and whispered, "Stay close. Protect her." Ash didn't move. He understood. Mira, tucked beneath the kitchen bench, was trembling. Her body had already begun to fold inward, her chest heaving in rapid, shallow bursts. Her eyes were wide but blank. She wasn't here, not fully. She was back there, wherever there had been. Wyatt eased toward the front door. Just as he reached for the handle, it turned. Slowly. Not a knock. Not a kick. A test. He didn't wait. Wyatt slammed the door outward with all his strength, catching the man on the other side off guard. There was a flash of motion, a grunt. Then Wyatt drove his shoulder into the intruder and tackled him into the snow. Ash exploded out of the cabin, teeth bared, a blur of muscle and fury. Another figure lunged toward Wyatt with a stun baton, catching his ribs with a crack of voltage. Wyatt reeled back, gasping, just as Ash lunged and took the attacker down hard into the snowbank. There was no yelling, no barking from the strangers, just movement, fluid, fast, silent, professionals, just like Eddie had warned. Wyatt scrambled for the flare gun, raised it, and fired into the air. The red bloom lit the clearing like blood on snow. Mira let out a sound that wasn't quite a scream, more a gasp that caught in her throat and shattered. She bolted across the room, then collapsed beneath the table, her legs twitching violently. Her body seized in fear, eyes rolling, mouth open but voiceless. Inside, Wyatt could hear her breath fluttering, too fast, too ragged. Outside, the intruders began to retreat. The flare had done its job. Light exposed everything. They melted back into the trees like shadows caught in the act. Ash didn't chase. He stood at the edge of the porch, growling low and steady, blood dotting the snow near his feet. Wyatt slammed the door and bolted it shut. Then he turned. Mira was shaking so hard, her paws barely stayed under her. She wasn't making a sound, but Wyatt could feel the panic pouring off her like heat. Her tail was tucked, her body pressed against the floor, as if she could become invisible if she only stayed still enough. Wyatt dropped to his knees. He didn't speak at first. Just looked at her. Really looked. The trembling. The breath that kept catching like a misfired engine. The eyes wide with an old, unspeakable memory. He reached out, slowly. Mira didn't flinch. She didn't react at all. That was what broke him. He slid closer, placed one hand on her chest, right where the flame-shaped birthmark was, and whispered, "I'm here. Nothing. I see you." Stillness. Then, with a voice cracked from frost and memory, he said the words he hadn't said in years. "I won't leave you, not like I did that day." Mira blinked once, her breath caught, and then released. Wyatt leaned down, pulling her into his lap. She didn't resist. Her head came to rest against his shoulder, tiny whimpers escaping like trapped birds. He wrapped both arms around her, holding her like something fragile and fiercely beloved. Ash returned, silent, uninjured, and lay down beside them. His body curled around the two like a barrier made of warmth and instinct. The fire still flickered. The cabin still stood. But the illusion of isolation was gone. They had come for Mira and Ash. They had come to erase what someone else had dared to save. But they had failed. And as Wyatt sat there on the cold wood floor, a flare gun on the table, his breath still visible in the air, he realized something he hadn't dared feel in years. Rage. Not the kind that destroys. The kind that protects. The kind that wakes a man up and makes him choose. He wasn't hiding anymore. Not from them. Not from himself. And certainly not from the love that had just screamed back into life in the shape of a trembling pit bull in his arms. The cabin had never been meant for more than one man and his ghosts. It was built for solitude, not shelter. A place to survive, not to begin again. But that winter night changed everything. The flare gun, the retreating intruders, Mira trembling in his arms, and Ash standing sentry beneath the stars. It was the moment something broke open inside Wyatt McCall. Not shattered. Opened. Like a wound that had waited years to breathe. In the days that followed, Wyatt didn't return to silence. He made calls. He met with April in town. He contacted Eddie again, this time not to chase shadows, but to chase truth. For the first time in years, Wyatt stopped surviving in the dark and stepped into the open. And he didn't do it alone. April offered her old barn. Eddie called in favors. Wyatt gave everything he had left, his pension, his land, his time. They called it the Quiet Pines Sanctuary. It began as a whisper of an idea, a place for dogs like Mira and Ash. Not just abandoned animals, but those trained for the wrong reasons, shaped into weapons, and then discarded when they refused to lose their souls. April used the word rehabilitation. Eddie called it justice with teeth. But Wyatt? He simply called it home. They cleaned out the barn, installed heated floors and soft lights. Eddie found old security fencing and transformed it into a safe perimeter. Wyatt spent days building custom kennels, none with locks, all with windows. April reached out to trauma-informed trainers and holistic vets across the state. Within a month, they had their first 10 rescues. Then they released the story. It wasn't a flashy expose or a breaking headline. It was a single video, just over 4 minutes long, filmed by April in the stillness of morning. It showed Mira lying in Wyatt's lap, her eyes closed, chest rising slow and steady. Ash sat beside them, alert but calm, his gaze not on the camera but on the trees beyond, as if still guarding. Wyatt's voice, quiet and unpolished, narrated over the footage. "These dogs weren't broken," he said. "They were betrayed. They didn't fail their purpose. They were failed by people who forgot they were living souls. But they survived. And now they're here, to remind us that even in silence, there's still hope. He ended the video with 7 words. This is where the healing begins now. They uploaded it to a new channel, Quiet Pines Stories. Within days, the video went viral. Comments poured in from across the country. People who had served, people who had suffered, people who had lost dogs, found dogs, loved dogs they hadn't known how to save. One letter came from a boy in Wisconsin. Just 9 years old, he had been pulled from a frozen lake the year before by a retired canine that had been rehomed with his family. His message to Mira was written in crayon, every letter shaky but strong. Thank you for surviving. You reminded me to be brave again. Another came from a veteran in Arizona. He wrote about the dog he'd trained overseas, how regulations had forced him to leave her behind. He'd never forgiven himself. I thought I'd buried the guilt, he wrote. But then I saw Mira's eyes, and I realized what I buried was the part of me that still believed there's something worth fighting for. If Quiet Pines had existed back then, maybe she'd still be alive. Photos started arriving next. Images of dogs lying beside wheelchairs, curled up beside beds, or standing beside children with mobility devices. Notes were attached to many of them. Found in an alley, now she sleeps on my pillow. He wouldn't let anyone touch him, until now. This one saved my son, twice. And then came something unexpected. Deliveries, boxes of food, blankets, collars, handmade beds with names stitched in bright thread, and dogs. Dogs left with handwritten notes on the porch. Old, scarred, shy, trembling, each one placed gently at the doorstep of a sanctuary now known by name. Wyatt built a bigger shelter. April expanded the medical wing. Eddie took over outreach, and 2 retired handlers from Washington moved into the guest quarters to volunteer full-time. And Wyatt? He kept writing in the same old notebook. He wrote about Mira, the way her ears now perked when she heard children laugh. He wrote about Ash, the way he gently guided the new dogs, never barking, just leading with presence. He wrote about Quiet Pines, not as a place, but as an answer to years of silence, an answer to every dog that had been trained to forget it was alive. An answer to the part of himself that had believed the world no longer had a place for men like him. But the world did. It just took 2 broken dogs to remind him. Sometimes the light doesn't come from the sun. Sometimes it comes from choosing not to turn away, from believing that scars are maps, not warnings, from letting your heart stay open, even when it's easier to stay locked. And on the gate to Quiet Pines, carved in wood faded by snow and sun, Wyatt etched the words that started everything. Not every survivor is safe, but every survivor deserves a place to begin again. The wind still swept across the trees in Quiet Pines, but it no longer howled like sorrow. It whispered. The snow came softer now, drifting gently through the pine boughs instead of slamming against cabin walls. It no longer felt like something to fear. It felt like a memory, cold but familiar, a reminder of how far they'd come. A year had passed since the night Wyatt McCall had opened his door to 2 pit bulls with no names and eyes full of unspeakable history. The world had shifted since then, not all at once, not with fanfare, but in quiet ways, like spring thaw beneath ice, bit by bit, day by day. The Quiet Pines Sanctuary, once just a converted barn and an idea born out of desperation, now pulsed with life. The wooden sign out front had faded in the weather, but the carved words still caught the light when the sun hit just right. Every soul deserves more than survival. It deserves a place to be loved back to life. And inside the gates, that's exactly what they had built. Mira, once a trembling ghost beneath Wyatt's porch, now wore her harness proudly. Certified and steady, she had become a therapy dog for veterans battling PTSD. She visited the local VA hospital every other Thursday. No barking, no commands, just quiet presence. She'd sit beside men who hadn't spoken in weeks and lay her head on their knees until they remembered how to breathe again. Ash had chosen a different path. He gravitated toward the quietest corners of the yard, where the anxious kids wandered, where the laughter came last, the ones who didn't reach out first. That's where he'd go. He didn't do tricks. He didn't lick faces. He simply sat beside them, let them lean on him, and somehow made it safe enough for tears to fall. Wyatt watched it all from the old bench under the birch tree near the center of the property. His beard was whiter now, his hands slower, but his presence was solid, like the foundation beneath the sanctuary itself. He never said much anymore. He didn't need to. The sanctuary spoke for itself. That afternoon, the yard was alive with motion. Volunteers raked leaves. Kids tossed tennis balls. One of the new rescues, a goofy three-legged mutt named Doodle, chased butterflies like he didn't know he'd ever been hurt. Ash lay in the sun, eyes half closed, while two children built a blanket fort around him. Mira rested beneath Wyatt's bench, chin on his boot, tail flicking lazily whenever someone passed. And that's when the woman arrived. She wasn't local. Wyatt could tell by the way she paused at the gate, one hand gripping the wooden post like she wasn't sure she belonged. Her other arm was wrapped tightly around a bundle of worn flannel. Inside it, a dog, small, sickly. Its eyes were closed, and its ribs too prominent. The woman looked like she hadn't slept in days. I don't know where else to go," she said softly. Wyatt stood slowly, joints stiff but sure. The woman stepped forward. "Someone told me about this place. Said you don't turn them away." She looked down at the bundle. "He's not like the others. He's afraid of everything. Even me." Wyatt didn't ask questions. He didn't need the dog's history. Didn't need to know the weight of whatever cruelty or neglect had carved such fear into its bones. He simply walked to the gate, unlatched it, and opened it wide. Behind him, Mira rose. Ash lifted his head. The woman crossed the threshold slowly, her eyes wide as the sanctuary unfolded in front of her. Dogs chasing, children laughing, volunteers kneeling beside creatures once too broken to meet a gaze. She began to cry. Wyatt reached out, steady and quiet, and took the dog from her arms. It didn't flinch, just breathed, barely. But it breathed. "Welcome home," he said. She looked up, startled. "That's it?" "That's it," Wyatt said. "Healing takes time, but the door has to open first." She followed him into the yard, Mira walking beside her like a guide, tail swaying gently. That evening, when the sky burned amber behind the pines and the first flakes of winter danced in the air, Wyatt sat back on the bench again. The fire pit glowed nearby. Ash lay curled in his usual spot. Mira nudged her new little charge with her nose, coaxing the pup into a blanket nest. And Wyatt, he opened his notebook again. He didn't write much, just a single line. "Even light takes time to reach the coldest places, but it gets there." Above him, the porch light flicked on, not a beacon, just a soft glow, enough to be found, enough to be followed. And beyond the fence, in towns and cities and shelters far from quiet pines, more letters were on their way. More stories, more survivors, because people had begun to believe again. Not just in dogs, but in each other. In the idea that no creature should be thrown away for being too gentle, too scared, too different. That surviving wasn't the end of the story. It was only the beginning. And Wyatt McCall, once a man who'd vanished into the trees with nothing left to give, now sat in the center of something beautiful and unbreakable. Something that grew every time the gate opened, and would keep growing as long as someone, anyone, still believed that love could turn survival into life. As the gates of Quiet Pines opened, and that frail little pup was carried inside, something else opened too, something in the hearts of everyone who watched it unfold. Because this wasn't just about dogs. It was about all of us. About how the world can hurt and discard, yes, but also how it can remember, rebuild, and love again. Wyatt once believed he had nothing left to give. But sometimes all it takes is one door opened in the snow to change the course of many lives. As the old saying goes, no act of kindness, no matter how small, is ever wasted. And as author Anne Lamott once wrote, "Hope begins in the dark, the stubborn hope that if you just show up and try to do the right thing, the dawn will come." If this story touched you, even just a little, please consider subscribing to Vale Marks. Your support brings us closer to reaching 1,000 subscribers, a milestone that helps us create more heartfelt, meaningful stories like this one. Leave a comment, share your thoughts, or tell us about a dog who changed your life. Because here, every soul matters, and every story deserves to be heard.